Hey everyone, my name is Jeff Moore. I usually go by Jeffrey Lee Moore because there is another nurseryman who is a lot more famous than me, and we're often confused for each other, and his name is also Jeff Moore. Anyway, I own a nursery in western Tucson out in Apra Valley. I've been growing cactus and succulents for about 20 years and growing plants for about 28 years. I'm one of those weird people who started growing plants at 12, and it's been kind of, sort of, definitely an addiction ever since, and it's fun. So my background beyond growing as a hobby and growing plants as a teenager is basically my whole life, my whole career. My first job was at a nursery at the age of 19, and that taught me a lot. Mostly, it taught me a lot about plants, but also how to be a person. So that was fun. Um, my my background professionally, after working at nurseries in my early years, I worked at the Desert Museum for 10 years, and a good portion of that I curated their cactus and succulent collection. Some of the skills that I learned there I adapted to my nursery, and I'll go over some of those skills in a bit, but I can guarantee most people don't need to utilize this unless you're doing large-scale cultivation. So, why would we want to grow from seed? And that's a good question, isn't it? Sometimes I ask myself, why am I doing this? Because it is very intensive. And I always come back to the same thing. I love it. And it's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, but man, it is cool. So, why would we do this? Sometimes there's some really rare plant that you simply don't have access to. A lot of these plants are available somewhere in the world, but that may not correlate to when you want it. You know, there's a cycle with plant availability. So if you first hear about something that is just not in the market anywhere, then you may have to grow it yourself. So the lack of availability can often be one of the triggers for deciding to grow something from seed. Another factor may be volume. Maybe you're somebody like me who's absolutely crazy and wants to start a nursery. And yeah, that's if you want to have a nursery, growing from seed really is an important thing. Or maybe you just have a large piece of property and you want to grow a lot of plants, but you don't have a lot of money. That was also me. So if you want to grow a lot of plants, sometimes growing from seed and growing your own plants is the way to go. It's not necessarily going to be less expensive, and that's where we go into saving money, because you're not gonna save money. It seems like you might, because you're potentially producing thousands of plants, but it takes a lot to grow them, and the seeds are not cheap. I typically spend $5,000 to $7,000 per year on seeds for my little nursery, little-ish nursery. And that's not even considering how many seeds I collect from my stock plants. So you don't really save a lot of money, but you know, maybe you need a hobby. Maybe you want to grow a bunch of plants to, I don't know, annoy your spouse. Um, People do that, I guess. Conservation is an important factor too. If something isn't available, and this goes back to being uncommon, but sometimes conservation organizations may want seeds from a particular site that they're revegetating. And revegetation that should be a fairly obvious term, but if you're new to that term, it simply means putting plants back into a habitat where they had occurred but had been taken out for various reasons. Maybe there was, I don't know, somebody built a house, and where the construction company drove through the desert to bring all the material and the equipment and everything. Maybe the organization needs the species from that site to grow more of that same genotype. So that's a little more than most people will have to consider. But if you're part of a conservation organization, that may make more sense to you. But the average person, that's really not something that you'd ever have to consider. One of the things that really, in my opinion, that really triggers me to grow from seed is breeding. I like plants, and I like plants just the way they are, but I also like plants when they're different. And there are a fair number of modern plant breeders. It is definitely a dying art, and you'll see a lot of cultivars out there. Say you go to most mainstream nurseries or Home Depot, a lot of those plants that are available are the result of breeding, and often propagated through tissue culture. That's micropropagation. We're not going to go into that. If you want to learn about tissue culture, that's what the internet's for, because I really don't have a strong grasp on how to do it, so I can't really teach you much about it. But you have to, if you're going to breed, and if you get to the point where you have an interesting cultivar, sometimes micropropagation makes sense, but you have to start with the breeding process, and that involves growing from seed. Breeding is simply hybridization, selecting different seedlings that have earned some level of merit for whatever reason. Maybe you're breeding for larger flowers, interesting leaves on aloes or agaves, for example, more flowering, a particular color. There are numerous reasons why you may want to breed a plant, and that is relevant for virtually all plants, not just cactus and succulents. The breeding process starts with growing the seedlings on from a particular cross. There's no other way to do it. So, why we may grow from seed can come down to propagation issues. There are some plants that are just impractical to grow from seed. Something like this pseudolithos, for example. There's really not much material there that you can cut, and you definitely can't divide it to grow a new plant. So seed is the only option. If you were to cut this, the base of the plant would probably die, and more than likely the top would too. Grafting is probably an option. Well, it is an option. But you can grow a plant this size up to flowering in 12 months. This plant is 12 months old, and it's already flowering. The majority of the plants had to be about 14 months old before they flowered, so getting mature plants can happen very quickly. These seeds are not all that expensive, and they're fairly readily available. So a solitary plant that's impractical to propagate from cuttings or division, the only way to do it is grow from seed. And the following are a few examples. This Medusoide Euphorbia, which you probably can't see a lot of detail. I know quality is lost on these images whenever we're broadcasting on this platform, and I'll gladly share these images with you. I'll have my email address at the end of the presentation, and you can ask me for any of these pictures. No big deal. This is a picture that I took at the Central Arizona Cactus and Succulent Society's show and sale back in 2018. I believe that this one was one of the vendors' submissions. This was not labeled, and I believe it was a Euphorbia hybrid, but these Medusoide Euphorbias there's really not much there that you can propagate from. All of those arms that come off, those really can't, you can root them, but you can't really grow a good plant from them reliably. Sometimes you can root those, and within a few years, you can get a nice looking plant. But growing them from seed, you'll get a good plant a lot faster. That is absolutely guaranteed. So, some plants don't grow good plants from cuttings, thus warranting seed propagation. Some, like this aloe, don't offset. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of aloes and agaves that are solitary. You have to grow those from seed. There's literally no other way around it without ruining the main plant. And this Aloe erinacea, that is one of the best specimens I've ever seen. That's at the Huntington Botanical Gardens in their conservatory. Those super cool black spines, blue leaves. I mean, I would say I love that plant. But anyway, very cool. You can buy seeds readily. They are not the most expensive seeds, but they're also not the cheapest. So be ready to spend a fairly, I won't say reasonable amount of money, but you'll spend a lot. They come up fairly readily if you have good humidity, but sometimes just do the best you can with what you can get, because these guys don't come around very often, and they are not cheap plants. So another plant that is solitary, these sand dollar cactus, Astrophytum asterias. These are some of the easiest plants to grow from seed if you have fresh seed. Astrophytum seeds typically don't live very long. Their viability will start to diminish after about 3 months. And after about a year, I don't get very good germination. So typically what I'll do is collect a lot of seed all at once, and as soon as I collect it, I'll go directly over to my seed house and I'll plant them. And they come up sometimes in 24 hours, just one watering, and they sprout. So these guys really do benefit from fresh seed. This particular species can be slow growing, but these have been flowering since they were 1 year old. These are plants that are 2 inches across, and they're only 1.5 years old. You can really push these things if you do all the stuff, and we'll go over all the stuff in a bit. So these guys, super easy to grow, but you need fresh seed. So if you were to cut this, you could graft it, probably root it, but then you don't really gain anything, because that bottom piece that's left probably won't grow much, and it'll probably die. So it's better to grow these guys from seed, and you have a whole bunch of them, and they're cool. So another Astrophytum there. You probably can't see a lot of detail, but in this tray there are approximately 6,000 seedlings. These are only a few months old, so you can see how quickly they grow. 6,000 seems like a lot, but they are very, very, very popular. And these I planted 2 years ago, and I have virtually none of them left. Volume is really important, especially for me. So that's a really dense planting. I shouldn't have planted them so closely, but you'll see some other examples in a bit where I did even worse. So give your seeds some space, but we'll go over that too. So here's a list of the things that you need to keep in mind whenever you're growing from seed, and we're about to talk about all of those details now. So soil. Soil is one of the most debated things when it comes to growing plants. Everybody has their own opinions, their own experience, their own ideas, and I'll let you interpret that. So when it comes to soil, I've found that it is the greatest investment that you can make when it comes to growing your plants. When it comes to growing seedlings or seeds, it is extremely important. Drainage, nutrient availability, all of that plays into this. The more I invest into my soil, the better my plants are. You'll see organic or inorganic listed there. I don't mean organic in the sense of like organic tomatoes that haven't been sprayed with pesticides or conventional pesticides. I'm talking about the presence of organic matter in your soil. Inorganic obviously refers to the absence of organic matter in your soil. The image here shows a soil with organic matter. When I use this, I will always sterilize the organic matter, and I'll bring a bag filled with this mixture, and I'll put it in the microwave for 5 minutes. I'll sterilize it in the microwave, and that helps a lot. It really helps a lot. But I choose to grow certain things in this type of soil, particularly aloes and agaves. I've found that they really don't have a strong tendency to rot, and they simply grow better with organic matter in their soil. So most cacti and many succulents I'll grow in my inorganic soil, and that's my recipe there. 80% pumice, 15% vermiculite, 5% calcium. Calcium, another heavily debated factor when it comes to growing plants. It is essential, especially when it comes to seedlings. There is calcium in our water, but our plants can't really use it. I'll add calcium in the form of gypsum sand and dolomitic lime. And you probably can't see it. I can barely see it, but there are these little black dots in the pots on the right, and that is the dolomitic lime. Once that gets wet, it just spreads evenly through the pot, and it's a calcium source forever, basically. You'll have a lot that drips through, you'll lose a lot, but there's a lot that stays in the container. Calcium will reduce seedling rot. Many of our seedlings damp off, and I'm sure many of you have heard that, especially if you've grown your own veggie starts, tomatoes and peppers. If you start those in containers before you plant them out in your garden, you'll have a lot that can just rot, seemingly for no reason. And a lot of that comes down to a lack of calcium. It also indicates the need for sterilization. And that can be, like I talked about with the organic matter in the previous slide, you may want to sterilize your organic matter, but it could also be the result of dirty pots. If you reuse pots, there are things that stay on the pot. And unless you sterilize it, those things can then end up killing your plant. So calcium will help, but there's a number of things to help with the reduction of rot. So lots of calcium. In the long term, there are some plants that will flower less if there's too much calcium available, but if your plants aren't rotting, they aren't dying. And the last I checked, a dead plant doesn't flower. So that's my typical inorganic mix. It looks like a bunch of pumice, but there's other stuff in there, I promise. On the right, you'll see the filled pots, all clearly labeled. Nice, neat little rows. I like neat rows. So that's what it should look like when it's done. This is what it looks like before. So since I have a nursery, I have a lot of pots sitting around. And I've learned, like I said early on, um, I use clean pots. So that's a brand new pot straight out of the box. That's sterile. I'll fill the container halfway with pumice, and the rest of it I'll fill with my mixed soil. The seedling roots don't typically go down to the bottom of the pot very quickly, so anything that I add to the bottom it's superfluous. There's really not a lot that's going to be damaged by having this with pure pumice. The 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 amendments that are in the soil that's on top, they work their way down. And so all that stuff gets down to the bottom of the pot anyway, and your plant has those nutrients available all the way throughout. It just takes a little time, and typically by the time those nutrients get down to the bottom, the roots have gotten down to the bottom of the pot too. So this is a slide showing some of my, I wouldn't say early seedling production, but this was like the middle. We'll say this is the middle of my seedling growing career. And this, I believe, was just something that I had on my front porch. So it was a while ago. I did cuttings in that same area, and you can see some burst rows and stuff there. But you'll also see some different container sizes. Why is that? There's a lot of reasons. Typically, what I'll do is grow the majority of my plants in these smaller pots that you can see. Those are 3.5 inch. I don't remember if they have a particular name, but they're 3.5 inch pots, 3.5 inches wide and 3 inches deep. I like shallow pots for my seedlings, and very rarely will I do anything in a deep pot unless the plant has a deep root system. So the pot that you choose to grow your plant in, your seedlings in, should reflect what the plant needs overall. If it's something like a Caudiciform, a Pachypodium, a Bursera, an Ocotillo, any of those what we call fat plants, I'll grow those in larger pots. The majority of my plants, a lot of my seed goes into these 3.5 inch pots. If I have a lot of seeds and I want to grow a lot of seedlings, then I'll go for a 6 inch or an 8 inch pot. And those pots are called azalea pots, mum pots, or bulb pans. You can find them for sale on various sites online, and typically most of mine come from a website called Greenhouse Megastore. They aren't the cheapest, but they don't have a minimum order, so you can spend $50 if you want to, instead of $2,000. $2,000 is more than $50, and I have more $50 than $2,000. So I'll often choose them because I can do a smaller order and get what I need for the time being, and save my larger orders for the larger companies. Greenhouse Megastore is a really good outlet for the backyard grower, the hobbyist, or even a large-scale grower. Again, not the cheapest, but we're not saving money in this, I guarantee. So I'll choose my pots based upon the plant's need, but often it does come down to what I have available. Sometimes I just don't have the right pots, and the plants will forgive you, but it does occasionally impact the resulting seedling. Some plants want a lot of room, especially those really cool, short, fat succulents like the Astrophytums that I had shown you earlier, barrel cactus. Man, they love short, wide pots. You'll have a barrel cactus seedling that looks really cool right away, but if they're bunched together and too closely planted, and I will show you a really good example of me having them too closely planted. If they're too closely planted, they tend to stretch a little bit, and they're not as perfectly round. And that may not matter. But as a professional, it really can impact whether someone buys a plant or not. And I've got to pay the bills. So I want them to look as good as quickly as possible so that I can sell that plant sooner and I'll have a happier customer and the plant just looks better for it. So choose the right density of planting, and that really comes down to the seed quality. Some seeds just don't come up very readily. I don't want you to plant your seeds so closely together that they're touching. Your seed distance, you should have some space between them, especially for fine seeds. There are some where you'll want to cover the seeds and some that you want to have on the surface. We'll go over that in a second. So moisture is one of the most important factors, without a doubt. No question that the seeds will not come up if there's not moisture available. I will water my seeds every single day. No failure. I mean, this is a system that I've set to automate. This is one of the skills that I picked up at the Desert Museum. I didn't know anything about irrigation. I knew how to grow plants. I had a huge library of plant information in my head, but I had never worked with irrigation controllers, valves, electrical, even simple stuff like the misting system. This is a picture that I took back when I worked at the Desert Museum. This is an old picture. That's like 10 years old. And you can't see the detail. I can barely see it, but that's a mister. There's a fine spray of water that's coming out of there. And that will water the whole bench. You need to water your seedlings, your seeds, and keep them wet, or they just won't come up. And there's a window where you can water and water and water, and at some point you'll have some come up right away, and at some point you'll have some come up a little later, and that often correlates to the humidity and moisture availability. Sometimes those seeds, as I may have mentioned earlier, sometimes those seeds will come up in 24 hours. Those Astrophytums that I had shown earlier, those sprouted in 24 hours. That means they got water once, and they had sprouted before the water had come on the next day. So for me, automation, having a valve dedicated to my misting system for my seedlings has really helped me a lot. There's no room for failure, well, except if the valves fail, and that's the problem with automation. If you have something that's set to run automatically, you don't forget about it. It's set to run. We're all busy, and it's easy to forget about something that is where the consequences are kind of low. If you don't water your seedlings, well, you know, it's not the end of the world. They're not going to tell you, hey, you forgot to water me. So it's something that you should do. You need to keep those seeds wet if they're going to germinate. And I'll show you my system and the structure that I have for starting these seeds, but often people will grow their seeds in a bag or an enclosed plastic container, and once they germinate, then they'll take them out of those containers or that bag. As I said a second ago, there's a window where the seeds can germinate. So if you pull them out of your germination chamber too soon, you may affect germination on some of the other seeds that weren't quite ready. And some plants do take a long time to germinate. Those Astrophytums, 24 hours is fast. And there are some plants that take 3 months before all the seeds that will come up. So you want to leave them in your germination area, whatever that area is. Leave them in there until you feel confident that, or satisfied, or both, that the majority of the seeds have come up, or the number of seeds that you want to come up have come up. If you just have one sprout and you planted 1,000 seeds, I'd leave them in a little longer. The trouble with leaving them in a more humid environment, especially if it doesn't have good air movement, they can rot in that environment, especially if you're watering from below. People choose to put their seed pots in dishes of water and water from below, so there's less soil disturbance. The reason I like these misters, there's a fine spray, and it doesn't disturb the soil. Those seeds stay in place. If there's a drop of water, a large droplet of water, that'll dislodge a young seedling. It takes a little while for them to really get situated again. And if that process happens over and over again, then those seeds really fail to thrive. So I like this misting option, but I also like to walk into my germination chamber. And again, I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. Bottom line, whatever you do, don't keep your seedlings too wet. You have to keep the seeds wet, but not the seedlings. You do need some level of drying, some moisture, because it won't grow without water, but you do need to have some control over it. If they're sopping wet all the time, you will rot them. Another important factor, and I'll probably mention this a lot because it's that important, fertilizer is one of the most important things for me, since I don't use organic matter in the soil. There's not stuff breaking down providing nutrients. So I have to supplement fertilizer, and I'll typically do that about once a week. I could do it every day every time I watered, or every day, which is typical. But that's a larger commitment that I rarely take the time for. But fertilizer will help some seeds sprout. I've found that rainfall will often initiate germination, but fertilizer will also help initiate germination, and I'm not sure why. I'm at the point where I don't really care as much about why something happens, just that it happens. I don't know if that means I'm getting old, whatever. That's just how it is. So if you fertilize your seedlings and fertilize your seeds, if you fertilize your seeds, they'll come up at a much higher rate. If you fertilize your seedlings, well, they won't be seedlings for very long. They'll be nice big plants. So fertilizer is an important factor, and I'll go over the type of fertilizer that I use, why, and for what. So temperature is fairly crucial. Many of our favorite plants do have a fairly broad window of temperatures that they'll germinate in, but most of our plants do come from really warm regions that have summer rainfall. So the habitat that the plant comes from will often dictate the conditions for successful growing. And in most cases, our seeds will grow better and they'll sprout better with warm temperature, but there are some species, particularly South African species, some plants from Baja, but just anything from all over the world. There are some plants that just come up better with slightly cooler soil temperature. You can gauge that if you want. You can get a thermometer, you can have a heat mat. There are some nurseries that only grow seeds in the winter, and they have this elaborate setup where there's a sand bed with a heat mat, and they keep it warm all winter. And I don't do that because I am poor. So this is a picture again of the Desert Museum's propagation bench, and that was kind of the inspiration for how I do my bench, but a little different. I have a separate house for growing these, and you can see the base of that. There's a heat mat below it, and that's to keep all those things warm. We would shut it off during the summer because I don't know if you realize, but summer is hot, and there's no reason to heat the soil if it's already hot. We would use that for rooting cuttings in the winter or sprouting seeds early in the spring. Generally, I like to plant when the soil temperature matches the plant's needs, rather than have an elaborate setup with heating the soil. I've done it, but I find the cost and the benefit don't really justify it for the way I do things. It may be something that you consider. I know a lot of us will grow things indoors under grow lights to get them sprouted, and then once they come up, they'll go outside. I've never been really fond of that, mostly because if you look around my house, I can't keep plants alive inside. I like to be outside, so I've always grown all of my stuff outdoors, and I know that's not practical for many people, and that's cool. So this is one way that you can do it, and that's a fairly small propagation bench. A lot of the larger nurseries will have whole greenhouses just for rooting cuttings and starting seeds, and that's pretty intense. This is fairly intense. This is a picture of my seedling greenhouse, and this is like a 100 square foot structure, and it's enclosed with plastic all the way around. It's also surrounded with metal that's been buried so that rodents don't get in and eat everything, but rodents still get in and eat some things. So you know, there's a balance between too much and too little, and I have a good balance here where I don't really have a lot of losses to rodents. And now that I said that, I'm sure that if I go out to this greenhouse right now, I bet I'll find a lot of things that got eaten. So, should knock on wood. There we go. So, labels, as you can see, there's a whole lot of labels in all of those pots. I cannot emphasize too strongly how important labels are. Sometimes I think I'm really smart, and I say to myself, I'll remember, I don't need to write a label, and then invariably I forget what it was, and years go by before I'm able to figure out what I planted. So these days what I'll do is inside, before I go out and plant all my seeds, I'll sit at my dining room table and I'll drink some coffee, and I will write out labels for everything that I'm planting that day. And sometimes I'll plant 200 or 300 species in one day. So that means I drink a lot of coffee while I'm sitting in there writing those labels. And towards the end of it, the labels aren't very legible, but whatever. Labeling is pretty much one of the more important things that you can do. It doesn't matter if you're able to get the plant to come up if you don't know what it is. Data on these things can really be important, especially after years go by and maybe you made a really cool plant, or you accidentally bought seeds of something really cool and didn't quite realize how cool it was when you bought the seeds. I know that's been the case for me, but I would strongly recommend labeling everything. And if you look at this picture, you'll see on the far right side, there's a whole tray of things that are not labeled. But that's okay, because there was one label for that whole thing, because they were all the same. So I cheat a little bit. You'll see the benches are pretty high. Those are up about 4 feet. And there's a number of reasons for that. It definitely cuts down on rodents climbing up to get to those seedlings. There's probably another reason why they're so high, but I have forgotten. Notice that the benches are made out of metal. There is a 2x4 that runs along the edge, but that's 1-inch wire. It's a heavy gauge wire that the trays are sitting on. I don't know what happens when they're sitting on wood, but I've found that a lot of seedlings, and maybe there's bacteria or fungi that that's in the wood, or that gets trapped in the wood and ends up working its way up. I don't know. But I've found that when I grow on benches that I can sterilize, and metal or plastic benches, if you can sterilize those, you'll have a lot less failure with your seedlings. Again, there's a lot of ways to do this, and you can use fungicides to control any issues with rot, or some issues with rot, but any step that you can take to reduce losses, well, those are important. So anything that will lead to your success, do it. And this is one of those things that has helped me. I like growing on those metal benches. Whatever. Do whatever works for you. I'm sure that if you do this long enough, I can learn a ton from you too. So everyone has their own experience, and this has been one of the things that has been really important for me. So lined with plastic all the way around, there's a solid roof, and half of that roof is a corrugated plastic, what's it called, fiberglass, that allows light through, so it's pretty bright in there, but it's not full sun. More importantly, it's really humid. And as I said earlier, I like to walk into my growing areas. I want to see everything, and if I have to open a bag or open a container to look at my seedlings, I'm pretty lazy, and I wouldn't go through those steps on a regular basis. If I can just open a door and walk in, that works for me. And again, that works for me, not that you have to do it that way. Know your own tendencies. If you work better doing something one way, then by all means do that. There's no absolute rules with this, except for moisture. That's the important rule here. That's one rule you can't break. You can break all the others or bend the other rules. But anyway, so depth for planting seeds. It's kind of a big deal. These are erythrinas. This is our native Erythrina flagelliformis coral bean. I don't know the exact distribution throughout Arizona. I typically will see these in southern Arizona, but I'll also see them up in the Catalina Mountains. These days I just collect seed from my plants because they're nice big flowering plants, and I don't want to go out into nature and collect seeds and take away from plants and habitat. I want to produce as much seed from my own plants as possible, so I can diminish the impact that I have on native populations. So these things, they're big seeds, man. They are really, really big seeds. They're also supposed to be poisonous, so don't eat them. Don't eat them. But this is something that I will typically bury. I'll put a decent amount of soil over them, at least so that they're completely covered. If you put too much on these, many of them would sprout through the soil, but some would suffocate and die before they were able to fully break through the soil. Cacti, on the other hand, I will plant right on the soil surface, and I may put a fine layer of pumice over some of the seedlings. But cacti, with the exception of the opuntiads, those larger choyas, prickly pears, and all the weird choya prickly pear type things from South America, all those things tend to like to be planted a little more deeply. And I don't know why, but again, why isn't as important as that it works. So anyway, so most cacti will be planted right on the soil surface, or maybe a fine layer of pumice. If I'm doing seeds that are microscopic, there are some that have seeds that look like grains of sand or even smaller. And those I will literally place a layer of fine sand on top of my previous inorganic soil mix. I'll place a layer of fine sand on top of that, and then I'll sprinkle these really, really, really microfine seeds on top of that. And they come up. They love that, but it's really hard to keep them from dying. And they don't rot. They just kind of die. I don't know. So those are a little more finicky. But typically, if you have a humid growing area where you're sprouting them, you don't need to cover them. And if you cover cactus seeds and most succulent seeds, if you cover them with soil, not pumice, you know, a little bit of pumice doesn't hurt anything because light and oxygen will still get in between the fine particles. But if you put soil on top of your cactus seeds or agave, aloe seeds, various seeds, they'll suffocate and they won't come up. They should be fairly close to the soil surface and definitely not covered with any fine particles. Larger chunks of pumice, a little bit of vermiculite, perlite, things like that, those are fine, but you don't want to have a thick layer, just one, at most, a single layer, and preferably not a layer that's touching. I want space between those chunks. So, let's move on. So, holy cow, they came up. And those are cactus little babies there. Well, what do you do? Well, that depends. There's a lot of things you can do. I probably mentioned that I can be lazy sometimes, so I'll typically leave them in the germination chamber for a bit, and that's a little better for me because the next stage that they would go into, there's a lot of potential for damage from wind or rain, so I want to keep these guys protected for a little bit. But if you're growing your plants at home and you do start them in a little bag or in a plastic container or any of the other methods, once they sprout, you do need to pull them out. And again, I went over that already, but I can't stress enough. If you have plants that have germinated and you feel confident that they're done germinating, get those guys out of your germination chamber. Get them somewhere where you have some good air movement and good light. They are still babies, and they're delicate. So you don't want too much sun on these. And you can see, I mentioned how deeply I'll bury them. And these are the red guys on the right. Those are Coryphantha borwiggi. Those I planted right on the soil surface. They came up in about 2 or 3 days. And that's cool. The ones on the right, the left, those are Phaerocactus 40 variety borealis. And those are cool. They were planted a little more deeply in the sense that there was a little more pumice placed over them. I've found that barrel cactus tend to like a little bit of covering, and I can go into why, but that's probably a whole different presentation. Seed collection is something that we'll talk about in a little bit, but knowing more about the plant's biology will teach you a lot about how you should plant the seed, when you should collect the seed, and when you should plant it. And again, we'll go over that in a bit. But your conditions really dictate what you should do after germination. And for me, as I said, I'll leave them in the germination chamber, usually for a few months, until they're big enough to withstand a pretty heavy storm coming through where there's a lot of rain that might dislodge the seedlings. So I'll move those out once I feel confident that they won't get destroyed by the rain. And that can vary. So as far as babies go, I'll often leave them in their community pots, and by community pot I mean one of those containers where all the seedlings have sprouted. I'll leave them in those community pots for a little while, and I'll just let the plant tell me when they're ready to transplant. And it's not like I get my head really close and I listen, because they don't talk, it turns out. They they get too big, and they start to touch each other, and they have spines. Well, many of them have spines, and when they touch each other, they poke. And when you have penetration, that can be an entry point for diseases. So that's something to consider. But if they're so close, and I think that's the next slide, but if they're so close that they're touching, they're going to keep touching. And sometimes they'll grow to the point where they smash each other, and there will be 2 or 3 that are a little more vigorous, and one that's a little smaller and less vigorous, and those other ones around it will grow to the point where they smash that other one, and it dies. So you want to monitor your seedlings. If they're growing so closely together that they're starting to impact one another, then you need to transplant them. And if you fertilize with any kind of regularity, you will have very large plants very quickly. And I will go over some of that in a bit as well. These are Euphorbia variegata. I collected those seeds a little while ago, planted them, they came up right away. Plants like this don't really suffer much if they're growing really densely. Let's see, so with fertilizer, what I will do is typically I will feed with a low nitrate fertilizer for most succulents. The 10-30-20 is what I'll typically use, just because that's what I use in the rest of my nursery for cactus and succulents. So I don't want a lot of green growth on those. I want health, and the 30-20 part of that's for overall stem, root production, and health. When I'm growing more leafy succulents like aloes and agaves, I'll put a little more, or in this case, a lot more nitrogen into them, because they need it. They look better, they grow better, and you're not sacrificing plant health or quality by doing that. I will use a little more nitrogen when I have slow-growing, small cactus seedlings. So I will put in a little bit of calcium nitrate into my 10-30-20 mix whenever I'm doing some species of cactus. Fertilizer is important, and what you use isn't as important as the fact that you're fertilizing. Any fertilizer is better than no fertilizer, but there are some that are just better than others. And that comes down to what you're growing. And I can answer those questions through email, but typically low nitrates are what you want. And so as far as transplanting, there's really no rule for transplanting, unless they're, as I said earlier, unless they're growing too closely together and they're smashing one another, or they're starting to get leggy and they're competing for light. Then it's really obvious that you need to transplant them. Again, let the plants tell you what they need. I will often, especially in the case of cyphostemas, any caduciforms, I'll typically leave them in their community pots longer than I would cacti. But there are some plants that really grow better if you take them out of their community pots early on. I learned years ago, when I'm growing bujums from seed, once they get up to the point where they're producing their horizontal branches, that's whenever I can transplant them into a larger pot. And by a large pot, I mean a 5-gallon pot. And I can get a good-sized plant, 18 inches or 2 feet tall, in about 2 years. Sometimes if you push these things early on, you can break through the juvenile phase. But in the case of the plant pictured here, this is Cyclostema corori. And I don't know if there's anything that you can do to make these grow faster. They're super cool. They're almost as cool as they are rare. It's really unlikely that you'll find too many of these for sale, especially since the company that sold the seed years ago, the owners retired and have since died. So there really isn't a reliable source for this species, and there's some plants that just are never going to be popular in nursery trade, and this is one that is less common just because it is so darn slow growing, and there isn't a very good source for seeds or seedlings. So you can see all of my information. Well, you probably can't see that, but you can see an example of what my label looks like, and I had all those details on the slide earlier for labels. But those guys are special plants, and now those are about 7 years old, and those plants are only now about 3 feet tall. There's just no way to really speed those up. So here's an example of some cactus that are 1 year old. Ancestor cactus megarrhizis, that had a really nice tuber and a really big plant for being 12 months old. And that's one of the benefits of growing in inorganic soil. You can get those roots deep, fast, and your plant will correlate to its root system. The more roots you have, the more plant you have. Again, lots of opinions when it comes to soil. This is what I like. Use what you like, but experiment and try different things. These are plants that are typically fairly slow growing, but very, very, very good sized plants for being 12 months old. And tuber quality is really impressive. Yeah, so you can get good sized plants really quickly. And this was from a few months ago when I separated my seedlings from last year. I put that off a little too long, but all of them did really, really well. And a lot of that does come down to having a nice big root system. So here is a great example of what you should not do. And I have a whole lifetime of examples of things that you shouldn't do. But we'll focus on cactus seedlings for right now. These are Phaerocactus pilosus, and I will generally grow about 10,000 seedlings. I'll plant 10,000 seeds, and I'll end up with anywhere from 200 plants to about 8,000 plants from various seedling plantings. So this was one tray out of 4 that had the seeds divided between them. So each tray had roughly 2,500 seeds, and in this case, pretty much all of them came up. And that seems cool until you have to plant them, transplant them. So when you have something this densely planted, it's really hard to get in and separate the seedlings. And sometimes you'll want to separate your seedlings when they're still fairly small. And the ones on the right, those are very, very small, and that's a size that I'd want to work with. But the only reason those are small is they had pushed up to the point where the roots weren't even touching the soil anymore. So they weren't getting water or fertilizer. They were just tiny because they didn't have the capacity to take up anything to make them grow. So that's the size that I prefer to work with, primarily because it's a little easier on the plant, but also the spines aren't as stout, and it doesn't hurt as much to transplant them. And that's always better than getting hurt. So here's the finished product. I will, when I'm doing volume like this, where I have thousands of seedlings, I will often grow in what is called a single set flat, where there's 100 per tray. And that's a lot. That's a lot. If you don't have a lot of volume, then you'll go into a pot that is the proportional size for the plant. You don't want to put a tiny seedling in a big pot unless you do. And that's something that comes with experience. There are some things that just grow quickly if you give them room to grow. And some, and I think I have an example coming up of that, some tend to be trapped if you leave them in a pot too small. These guys, these are a little over a year old from seed. These are from the batch before that. So those are about 2.5 years old from seed on the left. Those are 3-gallon pots. Those pots measure, I believe, 11 inches across. So that one plant at 30 months old is 8 inches across, not counting the spines. That's a pretty good amount of growth. The one on the right, that's one from the batch before that, and that's in a 10-gallon pot. That's not even 4 years old, and that's a big plant. So giving them room to grow is important. If you don't give them room to grow, they are trapped. The one on the left is the same age as the one on the right. They were the same size, but I transplanted some into larger containers, partially as an example of growth rate relative to space available, but also from a nursery perspective, I didn't need more 3-gallon pots, so I didn't transplant those into larger pots because I just didn't need them. Yeah, so if you keep them in a small pot, they will stay small. They really do grow proportional to their root mass, and they can grow a little bigger with time, but if your goal is to grow a big specimen quickly, don't be afraid to transplant it, and don't be afraid to fertilize. This is a greenhouse that I built a few years ago specifically for my cactus seedlings, and I'll fill this up and empty it once or twice per year. That's 1,000 square feet that I fill up with babies. And that's a lot of work, man. But it's cool. This has been really, really helpful because I can keep all the creatures out. Birds don't get in here. The rodents don't get in. Sometimes I can't even get in there because I didn't put a very good door on there. But yeah, make a good door. Having the space to grow your seedlings is helpful. Having them shaded when they're young is really important. As I said earlier, you don't want to put your babies right out into full sun. They will fry. And in some cases they won't, but in most cases they will. So you want to be a little more conservative when they're babies. Get them up to a reasonable size and keep pushing them, and then eventually they can go out into full sun. But a year like this, 2020, the summer has been really, really hard on plants, and plants that had been out in full sun virtually their whole lives have been suffering this year when they didn't have problems in the past, even when I had weeks on end over 120 degrees. So you'll definitely want to be a little cautious when you move a plant out into full sun, but at some point you have to do it. And my philosophy has always been, get them out when they're young and let the weak ones just die off. And that's kind of awful to say, but I don't want to sell somebody a plant that isn't hardy. So I'll push the limits, and I end up having some pretty heavy failures in some cases because the temperatures, the weather is just beyond my control. But I do want to push these out into the most sun that they can tolerate and still survive with about 95% success. And why I do that, when they're out in more sun, they tend to have better spination. And if we're growing cactus, we grow them for the spines. a lot of times we're growing the spineless things because they don't hurt, and that's cool. But typically, most cactus growers, we like nice heavy spines, and you don't get that unless they're getting really, really intense UV, but also calcium. So this is cool because I have a lot of space to work, a lot of space to fill, but there's also room to walk around, and it gives me a nice sheltered spot to get the babies to the point where they can go out into the rest of the nursery. This is what I call stage 2 of my seedling propagation. Stage 1 is the greenhouse where I start them, and then from that point they go into one of these shaded structures, and that's stage 2. And stage 3 is basically the rest of the nursery, which is about 2 acres, which is fun to take care of by yourself. There's a big question mark there. So when it comes to getting seeds, where do you get them? I mean, you'd think that they're cactus, they're succulents, the seeds are just out in the desert. And they are, unless they aren't. And generally they aren't, because we live here. And the things that are here, we can collect some seeds and clean them, and that's cool, but that means that we have these species to work with. If you're traveling and you're somewhere where you can legally collect seeds, go for it. That's kind of cool. Kind of a memento of the trip. But don't, if you're unsure, don't collect seeds, especially not in national parks or in other countries unless you have an import permit, and know the export regulations for the area that you're collecting. Having said that, it's often better to just buy seeds. And that comes with its own hassles and its own problems. There are some benefits and some not so great things that come along with it. One of the things that I've encountered when it comes to buying seed is getting viable seed. Many times seeds are collected in the wild, and wild seed has a substantially lower viability rate than garden-produced seed, and they can often be collected too early because someone, as I mentioned, maybe somebody's traveling and they collected seeds somewhere and they sold them to a seed company, but they didn't know what mature fruits looked like, and so they just collected what was there. And this is a scenario that happens all the time. The fruit needs to be mature. So if you are out collecting seed, know what is ripe and what isn't, and again, that just comes down to experience. Experimentation is key, and if you do it long enough, you'll find all kinds of weird things that you never thought about. So collecting seed is not such a hard thing when it comes to, well, collecting seed isn't hard, period, but when it comes to having something that you can plant, these dry fruits, like many of the barrel cactus, cactus, things that have dry fruits, you can plant those right away. There's virtually nothing you need to do except for collect those seeds and plant them. But in the case of something that has a wet fruit, and by wet I mean there's pulp in there, there's not a dry cavity, there's stuff surrounding those seeds, and you can plant them, but you're leaving a lot of sugar in place, which can cause rot later on, but it can also draw ants. No big deal, except ants will steal your seeds. How do I know this? Experience, because they steal a lot of seeds. Clean those seeds, wash them off. Here's one of my techniques: a coffee filter. Super duper easy. You can just toss it away at the end, or you can compost it, whatever. Maybe make coffee still. I don't know. I like to spread the seeds out on the coffee filter and give it a wash. And it's a little difficult to wash them in this coffee filter unless you have a thing for it to go in. And I'll use, I think it's called a a strainer. That was a hard word. So yeah, I'll put the coffee filter in this this mesh strainer, and I'll just run water through it. And after a while, it tends to not run through very readily, so I'll just let it drain through, and I'll let it dry. And this is the end result, where there's still some stuff on those seeds and some stuff left on the filter. You know, there's still some sugar there, but not enough to really draw in a lot of things that might impact those seeds. And not only will ants potentially steal seeds, but I have watched them literally go inside the seed and tear apart the embryo to take it back to their nest. And that's with larger seeds that they can get into, obviously. These are Panaeoceras gregii. These are our native night-blooming cereus. And those are big enough that I have seen smaller ants get inside those fruits, those seeds. So consider that. Once the seeds have dried, put them in an envelope, preferably a paper envelope, and label it clearly. I will add the species, genus and species. I will add the date that the seeds were collected, and I'll typically just do the month and year, but in some cases I'll do just the year. Again, comes down to what I need from that plant. Some plants want to age a little longer. Well, some seeds want to age a little longer before planting them. Panaeoceras gregii is no exception to that. If those are a year old or older, they'll come up very easily. Many barrel cactus need to age a little longer before they'll come up. So I will literally store them, and I have a file cabinet that is 4 feet tall over here filled with cactus seeds. Some of them are barrel cactus that are 14 years old, and they still germinate very readily. That doesn't mean that all of them need to age. Some seeds come up better when they're young, and some come up better when they're old. Again, one of those things that comes from experience, but if you do it long enough, you'll be able to figure it out. But I also will answer any questions if you want to email me about specifics for what to do for a particular plant. I may not have all the answers, but I can definitely throw some out there. But if I don't know the answer to something, I'll definitely tell you. I'm not going to make it up. So one of the most important things when it comes to collecting seeds is always collect seeds from the best plants. And I cannot stress this enough. My very first job, we collected seeds. When I worked there for 5 years, we collected seeds from our stock. We'd go out and we'd collect seeds. But then after a while, they started collecting seeds not from just the general population. They'd kind of overreact when they realized that they were low on stock, and they would collect seeds from what was left over, not from the best. And over the 5 years that I worked at this particular nursery, I did watch their plant quality diminish, ultimately to the point where they stopped growing their plants from seed. And that, I believe that came from collecting seed from plants that weren't the best, the ones that were leftovers. And there's still the potential for growing good plants, but I find that if I hold back my best plants and collect seed from those, I end up with really, really, really nice, sturdy, healthy plants that grow a little more quickly. It's a long-term process of collecting and improving my stock. And you can do the same thing. If there's something that really performs nicely for you, grow seeds from that. So helpful. And this adenium, I love that plant. I wish that I hadn't sold that, but that was one that grew from one of the absolute best plants that I had. Just stunning. And there's the typical sunset ending. If you have any questions, my email is up there at the top of the screen. Feel free to hit me up if you have any questions or comments or complaints. I hope you don't have any complaints. Anyway, let me know if there's anything that I can do to help you out. Thanks for your time.